So the next gland we're going to look at is the adrenal gland. And there's two adrenal glands. They're paired. They sit on top of the kidneys, so sometimes they're referred to as the suprarenal glands. There's two parts to the adrenal glands, and so they're really functionally two glands, structurally and functionally. There's the outer part called the adrenal cortex, which actually has 3 layers of glandular tissue, and it's going to have different hormones that it secretes, not specifically in those different 3 glandular areas, but for the most part separated. And then there's the adrenal medulla, which is going to be a part of the sympathetic nervous system. So it works with a preganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system to produce norepinephrine and epinephrine as hormones in this case instead of neurotransmitters. So let's look at the cortex first, so the outer part of the adrenal gland. So this is the area of the adrenal gland that produces over 24 different hormones, and all of these hormones produced from the adrenal cortex are going to be collectively called corticosteroids. Now, we're not going to go into detail over all 24 different hormones, but for each area, we're going to kind of pay attention to a couple of key players. So all of these corticosteroids are steroid hormones, so they're not stored in cells, they're going to be synthesized kind of on the spot. And the rate of release is just going to depend on their rate of synthesis, which makes sense. So there's 3 layers of cortical cells or of tissue in the adrenal cortex, and each of these layers can produce different types of corticosteroids. So we have zona glomerulosa. This area is going to produce mineralocorticoids, whereas zona fasciculata is going to produce glucocorticoids. And then zona reticularis is going to produce gonadocorticoids. So we're going to look at examples of a mineralocorticoid, a glucocorticoid, and gonadocorticoid for these 3 layers of cortical cells. So let's look at a general kind of microscopic view of the adrenal gland. This does also include the adrenal medulla, so this kind of the middle of the gland. And then from the inside out, as we move to the cortex, the first row is zona reticularis. Then you have zona fasciculata, and then zona glomerulosa. Now, zona glomerulosa produces mineralocorticoids. So we'll primarily find hormones like aldosterone produced from the cells in zona glomerulosa. Zona fasciculata is going to produce mainly cortisol, but also produces some androgens. So cortisol is an example of a glucocorticoid, whereas androgens are examples of gonadocorticoids. And we see the same kind of shared production of those 2 types of hormones with the zona reticularis. So cortisol and androgens both produced by zona fasciculata and zona reticularis. So let's look closer at mineralocorticoids. Again, our focus for mineralocorticoids is going to be on aldosterone, which is the most potent mineralocorticoid. Mineralocorticoids in general are going to be able to regulate electrolyte concentrations. And we're looking at aldosterone as able to regulate sodium concentrations. But the regulation of electrolyte concentrations in the extracellular fluid is important for maintaining homeostatic balance among many different types of tissues. So the importance of sodium is listed here. That's sodium ions, and that is the effect that wherever sodium goes, water follows. So we can definitely affect extracellular fluid volume, blood pressure, even the level of other ions, because oftentimes the reabsorption of sodium is going to go hand in hand with the secretion of other ions, such as that of potassium. Potassium is also very important because it sets resting membrane potential of cells, so it's important for repolarizing neurons. But let's turn our attention to aldosterone, again, most potent mineralocorticoid. And again, it's going to stimulate sodium reabsorption by the kidneys. So it's going to reabsorb sodium in the kidney tubules when acted upon, or we'll see that reabsorption in the kidney tubules when acted upon by aldosterone. And because we're adding sodium back to the blood and water follows salt, when we add salt to the blood, we essentially are going to add water. We're adding all this extra stuff to blood vessels, which are a closed system, and that's going to increase the volume of stuff in the blood, so increase blood volume. And it's also going to increase blood pressure because if there's more stuff in the blood, more volume, there's going to be more pressure pushing on the peripheral walls of blood vessels. Now, the reabsorption by the kidneys of sodium is going to go hand in hand with the elimination of potassium by the kidneys because of the ion channel used for the reabsorption of sodium by the kidneys when aldosterone is acting. So when aldosterone acts on the kidney tubules, we get the reabsorption of sodium, water follows, and we're going to get the elimination of potassium. So elimination from the blood, reabsorption to the blood. So the effects of aldosterone are short-lived. We're going to see that the synthesis and activation of transport pumps that move sodium one way and potassium the other way, which you may remember from Chapter 3 of your lecture textbook in A&P 1, are very similar to the sodium-potassium ATPases or transport pumps that we see in neurons. So that exchange is going to be antiport transport. And we're going to see that there's many different factors that regulate aldosterone secretion. We'll look at each one. So first we'll look at the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, which is a term you'll hear multiple times in this course, especially when we get to the urinary system. We're going to see the plasma concentration of potassium dictate what happens with aldosterone secretion. And then we'll also see that ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone release, can regulate aldosterone secretion, as well as adrenonatriuretic peptide. So mineralocorticoids is what we're looking at, produced from the adrenal cortex, and we're looking at ways to stimulate aldosterone secretion. So we're just looking at kind of that first one that we just reviewed. So the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism is a phrase that is basically describing a pathway. So renin from the kidneys causes the production of angiotensin, 1 then 2, and then angiotensin causes the production of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. So this entire long name that we're looking at, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, is just a pathway. The stimulus for this mechanism is decreased blood pressure. We know that aldosterone can increase blood volume and blood pressure, so it makes sense that this stimulus would cause the production of aldosterone. So decreased blood pressure is going to stimulate special cells in the kidneys, though, to release renin. So renin is going to be released as a response or in response to decreased blood pressure. Once renin enters the blood, it acts on a plasma protein. And that plasma protein is angiotensinogen, and that's going to trigger an enzyme cascade that results in the creation of angiotensin 1, then angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is going to be a stimulator of aldosterone release, or is going to be a chemical that acts on the adrenal cortex and causes the release of aldosterone into the blood, ultimately then increasing blood pressure and volume. If we have a high level of potassium in the blood, we can get rid of that potassium if we release aldosterone, because one of the effects of aldosterone is sodium reabsorption, but potassium elimination. So increased potassium ion levels directly stimulates aldosterone release, and a low level of potassium ion would inhibit it. So we're going to see that changing the levels of potassium actually directly influences the cells of the adrenal cortex, the zona glomerulosa cells, that release aldosterone, a mineralocorticoid. We also know that adrenocorticotropic to a small amount can cause aldosterone release, mostly when you're under stress, and that adrenonatriuretic peptide is an antagonist, or with aldosterone is a part of an antagonistic pair, meaning that adrenonatriuretic peptide does the opposite of aldosterone. So adrenonatriuretic peptide, abbreviated ANP, is secreted by the heart, and it's secreted by the heart in response to high blood pressure. While aldosterone can increase blood pressure and blood volume, so adrenonatriuretic peptide, if it's being produced in response to high blood pressure, it's going to act to decrease that high blood pressure, so bring it down. So ANP definitely blocks renin, it blocks the angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. It's going to reduce aldosterone secretion, so it's going to act to reduce blood pressure, whereas aldosterone causes its increase. So definitely ANP, adrenonatriuretic peptide, and aldosterone are antagonists. They do the opposite of each other. I definitely recommend Figure 15.14, looking at the major mechanisms we just went over controlling aldosterone release. You can see the two primary regulators, which are the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism and plasma concentrations of potassium, and then other factors. So definitely adrenocorticotropic release and adrenonatriuretic peptide release are going to be minor factors in controlling aldosterone release. Adrenonatriuretic peptide, again, is that antagonist. We only get a little bit of aldosterone release when we get excess adrenocorticotropic hormone release from the anterior pituitary. but it's mainly decreases in blood pressure and blood volume, which causes the release of renin from the kidneys and the production of angiotensin II, and increases in potassium ion concentrations in the blood that are the main regulators for the production of aldosterone from the zona glomerulosa cells of the adrenal cortex. So we can see here in this image all that summed up. They all work together except for AMP to increase aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex, which targets the kidney tubules and leads to increased reabsorption of sodium. But that increased reabsorption of sodium is going to follow or be seen with increased potassium excretion or the elimination of potassium. And that would increase blood volume and blood pressure, which we discussed earlier. You add more stuff to a closed system, it increases the volume in that closed system. The volume puts more pressure on the walls of the closed system or the peripheral walls of blood vessels, and that increases pressure. We also want to look at a homeostatic imbalance. So a homeostatic imbalance associated with a mineralocorticoid and aldosterone specifically is aldosteronism. So aldosteronism is a hypersecretion, so overproduction of aldosterone. It's usually due to a tumor in the adrenal gland. It could be specifically in the adrenal cortex if it's small, but it could be a tumor that takes over the entire adrenal gland. There's two major problems with aldosteronism, especially if caused by a tumor, and that is high blood pressure or hypertension. That is dangerous and causes excess swelling due to the excessive reabsorption of sodium and water because you have too much aldosterone being released. These individuals definitely need to monitor their sodium intake, but the excretion of potassium as a result of excessive sodium reabsorption is also a problem because potassium is going to be able to repolarize neurons. So it's definitely going to be very important for not only the nervous system, but also the skeletal system and other types of muscles. So the excretion of potassium does lead to abnormal non-responsive neurons and muscle. All right, next we're going to move on and look at glucocorticoids. So we're still looking at the adrenal cortex, but we're moving away from the mineralocorticoid. Glucocorticoids are so named because they influence metabolism of cells and help us resist stressors. They also generally keep blood glucose levels relatively constant. So that's what we're getting the name glucocorticoid from. So again, steroid hormones. A couple of different glucocorticoid hormones to look at. They maintain blood pressure by increasing the action of vasoconstrictors, but the main glucocorticoid we're going to look at is cortisol or hydrocortisone. So cortisone and corticosteroid are also glucocorticoids, but our main focus is going to be cortisol, which is the only glucocorticoid in significant amounts in humans or produced in those significant amounts. So let's look at the regulation of its secretion. So cortisol is released in response to adrenocorticotropic hormone, which makes sense. All of the hormones of the adrenal cortex are released in response to adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, just a reminder, is coming from the anterior pituitary, and it's being released in response to the release of corticotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So let's take another step back. We know the hypothalamus releases or secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones. So a releasing hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is able to act on the anterior pituitary. So that's where we're getting adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is acting on the adrenal cortex and leading to the production of glucocorticoids, since we're looking at those specifically. So increased cortisol levels would then be able to negatively feed back and inhibit those adrenocorticotropic hormone productions, and it would also inhibit the corticotropin releasing hormone. So we're able to negatively feed back and inhibit the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary and their hormone secretion once we have those increased cortisol levels in response to generally stressors. So cortisol secretion cycles are going to be governed by patterns of eating and activity. Your body pays attention to acute stress, infection, physical or emotional trauma, and that all can interrupt cortisol rhythm. So there is a normal amount of cortisol that should be in your body, but the overproduction is because of either acute stress or chronic stress. And we'll look at the differences coming up. The central nervous system can definitely override cortisol inhibition. So we can get more cortisol production even if we're inhibiting adrenocorticotropic hormone and corticotropin releasing hormone production. And that would lead to more cortisol secretion. So prolonged stress involves a mechanism. Sorry if you hear the train in the background. All right, so let's look at the actions of cortisol. So cortisol causes increase in blood levels of glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. And That makes sense because we're going to have a metabolic effect by using this glucocorticoid. And one of those metabolic effects is going to be the use of glucose. So gluconeogenesis, which is the formation of glucose from fats and proteins, would require kind of the mobilization of these fatty acids and amino acids. Remember, amino acids make up proteins. So we're going to encourage cells to use fatty acids and really kind of encourage them to use protein. And we're going to save kind of the direct glucose that our body takes in for the brain. The brain really relies on a stable supply of energy or nutrients like glucose in order to make ATP and run its neurons. Other functions of cortisol actually enhance vasoconstriction. So when someone's stressed, if you've ever heard someone say, calm down, your blood pressure is going to rise, there is some truth to that because of the function of cortisol in enhancing vasoconstriction or increasing blood pressure. And the reason that cortisol would do this is to quickly distribute nutrients to cells, to distribute these fats and these amino acids from proteins in order to make glucose. Now, excessive levels of glucocorticoids are dangerous. They can depress cartilage and bone formation, inhibit inflammation by decreasing release of inflammatory chemicals. You see here the list: depress immune system, disrupt normal cardiovascular, neural, gastrointestinal function. None of it's sounding good. Short term, cortisol is making sure kind of vital organs and vital functions are able to persist until you get to a safe place or a safe environment. But long-term stress can lead to severe depression of cartilage and bone formation, the movement of fat around the body, kind of the malformation of tissues. It can lead to someone getting sick easier because of depression of their immune system. It can lead to heart issues, blood pressure issues, problems with their GI tract. So glucocorticoid drugs can control the symptoms of many inflammatory diseases, but it's not recommended to use these for a long period of time because of the effects of excessive levels of glucocorticoid use. So there are undesirable effects associated with the use of glucocorticoid drugs or long-term stress. So let's look at an example of a syndrome that actually causes the hypersecretion or the overproduction of glucocorticoids. That would be Cushing syndrome or disease. And it does just what we were looking at: depresses cartilage and bone formation, suppresses the immune system, inhibits inflammation, disrupts neural, cardiovascular, and gastrointestinal function. That makes sense because we just looked at the excessive level of glucocorticoids and the action caused therein. So this syndrome having those effects makes perfect sense. The reason that hypersecretion may occur, so hypersecretion of glucocorticoids like cortisol, would be because of a tumor on the pituitary that maybe causes the overproduction of adrenocorticotropic hormone, therefore the overproduction of glucocorticoids, or tumor on the lung, the pancreas, the kidney, or the adrenal cortex. Especially the overuse of corticosteroids, so the abuse of those types of drugs, can cause Cushing syndrome. So Cushingoid signs are moon face and a buffalo hump. So it's kind of a rounded, softer looking face, and a buffalo hump is a redistribution of fat on the back of the cervical spine. And the treatment for hypersecretion or Cushing syndrome, so hypersecretion of glucocorticoids or Cushing syndrome, would be the removal of a tumor or discontinuation of the drugs, but oftentimes some of these effects are long-lasting. Now, hyposecretion of glucocorticoids is called Addison's disease. So that's a deficit in the production of glucocorticoids and sometimes also mineralocorticoids like aldosterone. So a decrease in plasma glucose and sodium levels would result from a hyposecretion of both of those, glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids, which is common with Addison's disease. So that can lead to kind of reduced metabolism of cells, not enough glucose or fatty acids being provided for the upregulation or calorogenic effects we saw related to glucocorticoids. Severe dehydration because of the lack of reabsorption of sodium, therefore water is going to be excreted in higher amounts. We could see hypotension because of the lack of sodium being added back to blood volume. So treatment would actually be corticosteroid replacement therapy. If not enough glucocorticoids are being produced, we can replace those. But early signs of Addison's disease are actually a bronzing of the skin. So if you know someone that always looks extremely tan and they don't go out in the sun or anything like that, especially if they are in a family that's relatively pale, then a bronzing of the skin could be indicative of an early sign of Addison's disease. And that would be due to high levels of adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that triggers melanin production in melanocytes, which are cells that can change the pigment of your skin. Here we can see a patient who has a buffalo hump on their back and a moon face. And again, these are not meant to be derogatory terms. They're just characteristic of what occurs in an individual who is suffering from Cushing syndrome. So Cushing syndrome, again, is going to be, let's go back and look, hypersecretion, whereas Addison's was hyposecretion. So we're looking at hypersecretion of glucocorticoids like cortisol, and that's going to cause a redistribution of fat in certain areas, sometimes on the back of the cervical spine, and have redistribution of fat around the face, which can kind of loosen the face and make it kind of more round. Next, we're going to be looking at the gonatocorticoids produced by the adrenal cortex. A little bit less to look at here. Gonatocorticoids are adrenal sex hormones. They're really weak androgens. They look a lot like male sex hormones or testosterone. And some of them are actually a little similar to estrogen, like androstenedione and dehydroepiandrosterone. I always just call that one DHEA, long term. But these weak androgens can contribute to kind of the onset or the beginning of puberty and the appearance initially of secondary sex characteristics. They're responsible for the sex drive in women, and they're actually the source of the only estrogen produced in postmenopausal women. So again, gonatocorticoids also produced by the adrenal cortex. The hypersecretion of these weak androgens can cause adrenogenital syndrome or masculinization. And that's not really noticeable in adult males because they're already masculinized. But in females and prepubertal boys, this masculinization can actually cause, for females, a beard, a masculine pattern of body hair, their clitoris to enlarge and resemble a small penis. In boys, their reproductive organs may mature very early, and their secondary sex characteristics may emerge early as well. But again, the adrenogenital syndrome, not really noticeable in adult males. They're already masculinized with testosterone, so really no effect. The adrenal medulla is going to be our next focus. So the adrenal medulla is kind of that middle portion of the adrenal gland. Again, you have two adrenal glands, so you have two adrenal medullas. In the adrenal medulla, there are the medullary chromaffin cells. They're responsible for synthesizing the catecholamines. Catecholamines may be a term you heard in A&P1 when you first were introduced to neurotransmitters and their classification. The catecholamines include epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, it's mainly epinephrine produced by the chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla, but norepinephrine is produced as well. Now, the effects of catecholamines are going to be similar. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are both included in these effects that I'm about to list. Vasoconstriction, increased heart rate, increased blood glucose levels, blood being diverted to the brain, heart, skeletal muscle. And if this list kind of sounds like what happens with your fight or flight response, then good, because your adrenal medulla is linked to your sympathetic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system is responsible for your flight or fight response. So we would want vasoconstriction to speed up blood flow to important organs like your brain, your heart, your skeletal muscle. We would want increased blood glucose levels. There's the train again. Increased blood glucose levels so that we have energy going to cells so they can use that energy along with oxygen to make ATP. And we'd increase your heart rate also to improve getting these nutrients to the cells that need them most when you're trying to fight or flee a situation. All right, the adrenal medulla, again, releasing those catecholamines, is going to be able to work with the sympathetic nervous system. Now, epinephrine is going to be more of a stimulator of metabolic activities, whereas norepinephrine, more of an influence on the peripheral vasoconstriction and blood pressure. But in general, they both have the same effects. So for an example, epinephrine does work best with bronchial dilation, blood flow to skeletal muscles, and the heart. Oftentimes, if you're asked a question about catecholamines or the sympathetic nervous system, and something where you're trying to guess epinephrine or norepinephrine and both are present in a multiple choice question with only one answer, the answer is going to be epinephrine if it has something to do with the heart and the sympathetic nervous system. So responses to stressors from the adrenal medulla are going to be brief. So stress responses from the adrenal medulla via the secretion of catecholamines, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, are for brief stressors. Unlike adrenocortical hormones, which are usually produced to long-term stressors such as fever or starvation, things like that. So let's talk about stress and the adrenal gland, because we definitely have stress responses handled differently from the adrenal gland depending on if we're talking about the adrenal cortex or the adrenal medulla. So, for example, we have the pathway for the production of hormones from the adrenal medulla here. So that's going to handle short-term stress. So we would have hormones from the hypothalamus communicate not with the anterior pituitary, but actually they're going to be acting more like neurotransmitters and communicating down the spinal column and to, via preganglionic neuron, the adrenal medulla. And as a result, the adrenal medulla, due to this stress response, is going to produce catecholamines, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, which will lead to cardiovascular effects, respiratory effects, and metabolic effects. So you see here with short-term stress, we would use the sympathetic nervous system and its connection to the adrenal medulla to, say, flee a fire or run from a bear in the woods, or if you're threatened, fight someone. Now, long-term stress is definitely handled by the hypothalamus communicating to the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary producing hormones that then go to the adrenal cortex. So that pathway includes corticotropin releasing hormone talking to the anterior pituitary, the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary, the adrenocorticotropic hormone acting on the adrenal cortex, and the production of glucocorticoids and to some response aldosterone, because we usually get both. So this will have renal effects and metabolic effects. Those renal effects are really from the mineralocorticoids like aldosterone, whereas the glucocorticoids are going to have more kind of metabolic effects where we mobilize proteins, we mobilize glucose, we mobilize fatty acids. And the mobilization of, again, proteins is via the mobilization of amino acids or breakdown of proteins. Now, this is fine if the long-term stress response isn't actually long-term, but oftentimes the cortisol, the glucocorticoid that we're talking about the most, is going to be produced in kind of overabundance, or because stress responses that are responded to by cortisol production usually last longer than they should, such as fever, starvation, homelessness. These conditions are unfortunate, but do trigger an actual hormonal response in the body that is dealt with long term, not in the best way. Short term, it's great. We can mobilize all these nutrients. We can get cells all of the energy they need because they have the nutrients, they have oxygen, they can make ATP. But long term, it's going to increase stress in the form of hypertension, increased heart rate. And we're going to have kind of a redistribution of nutrients like fat and like protein. We even have weakening of muscles if the stress is too prolonged. So just differences with how we're handling our stress response depending on if we're using our sympathetic nervous system and its communication with the adrenal medulla, or we're using just the endocrine system and the communication from the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary to the adrenal cortex. So let's look at some homeostatic imbalances associated with the adrenal gland, specifically now the adrenal medulla. So the hyposecretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine, not really a big deal. They're not essential to life, so therefore there's no problem associated with their hyposecretion. Hypersecretion, though, of these catecholamines could lead to symptoms of uncontrolled sympathetic nervous system. So we could kind of have symptoms that make a person feel like they're fighting or fleeing all the time. So hyperglycemia, so increased glucose in the blood because the cells think, or the body thinks cells need this glucose. Increased metabolic rate, rapid heartbeat, palpitations, hypertension, increased nervousness, sweating. So really all these symptoms that great if we need a short-term response from our sympathetic nervous system. We need to fight or flee. But if it's occurring because we have a hypersecretion of catecholamines and we're not fighting or fleeing something, these symptoms are very annoying, and that's saying it lightly. So oftentimes hypersecretion can be due to pheochromocytoma, and that's just a tumor of the medullary chromaffin cells. So that would have to be treated. I do recommend table 15.5, at least to the point of looking at the effects of these different hormones So mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonatocorticoids. Definitely know that the mineralocorticoid we're focusing on is aldosterone. The glucocorticoid we're focusing on is cortisol, and that the gonatocorticoids are weak androgens. Know that catecholamines include epinephrine and norepinephrine, and know that they are associated with the sympathetic nervous system, which allows us to fight or flee. Next, we're going to be looking at the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is really small. It's in the brain. It hangs from the roof of the third ventricle. Pinealocytes secrete melatonin. Melatonin is the hormone secreted by the pineal gland and is derived or similar to serotonin. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the pineal gland. You've talked about it in A&P1. I'm not going to add a whole lot to it that you shouldn't already know or remember slightly from A&P1, but it does help with your day or night cycle. That regulates your circadian rhythm. It's involved in a lot of processes that have a rhythm that's similar to that kind of sleep-awake or day-night cycle. It is going to be able to produce antioxidants. It has detoxification effects in certain cells, and it does to a small extent affect the timing of sexual maturation and puberty, but know mainly that the pineal gland is associated with the circadian rhythm and the regulation of day and night cycles. You may or may not be familiar with melatonin because you might take a supplement of melatonin in order to get to sleep at night. All right, so before we move on, let's just kind of review, not any in-depth, but just kind of review what organs have we covered. We definitely looked at the hypothalamus. We looked at the pineal gland. We looked at the pituitary gland. We also talked about the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland. We haven't touched on the thymus, but we did definitely spend time on the adrenal glands. We haven't touched on the pancreas, and we haven't touched on the gonads, so ovaries in females and testes in males. So all of that to come. So make sure you're reviewing both Part A and now Part B of the Enneagram PowerPoint, and we'll finish up next time.